So we've been talking about waste, but then there's hazardous waste. So what is hazardous waste? Hazardous waste is waste that is toxic either for the environment or for human health. And generally speaking, nature doesn't create hazardous waste. Nature does a few things really well. It works locally. It does things at room temperature, which tend to be more efficient and can be done biologically, and it doesn't create toxins. But we do. So what are the sources of some of this toxic waste? Well, a lot of the toxic waste comes from industrial processes. Here's just a couple examples. Paper. You think of paper, that's a natural material, but a lot of toxins get made in the creation of the paper. And then, of course, electronics have a lot of metals and dangerous things that go into our electronics, and again, solvents and things like that. Small businesses are another source. Gas stations use gasoline and all sorts of other things that go into the internal combustion engine. And dry cleaners, I always wondered as a kid what the dry meant. How did they clean clothes dry? Well, dry means without water. It doesn't mean without liquid. These clothes traditionally were soaked in solvents that cleaned the clothes without water. And then the solvents evaporate away. So I'm not saying that it's bad for you, but all these solvents are then there and then have to be disposed of. And there are methods of doing this now that are more ecological. I don't know what they are, but I've seen some places say that they use sustainable methods. And then let's not forget about households. We actually have hazardous waste in our own homes. These might be bug killers, ant killers, cleaners, paint, solvents, batteries. They have either metals or they have poisons in them to kill things, or they're hardcore chemicals that are ripping apart molecules. So none of these things can actually go into the landfill. They're not supposed to. It doesn't mean people don't put them in the landfill, but when you put them in the landfill, then you're going to create problems. They might leach out. So what you're supposed to do is you treat them before they go into disposal. The problem with that is that this treatment is costly and it's complicated. If you take waste to the hazardous waste site in Orange County at the landfill, they'll separate it into compartments. Some of that does get treated so that it can be wasted more traditionally. But it's just best not to produce them in the first place. That's going to be the easiest thing to do in the long term, create a lot fewer problems. Because this is where it goes. This actually is a hazardous waste landfill. And really, this is the best that we can do. I mean, talking about burying your head in the sand, we literally are just burying this material and just hoping that it doesn't come out. But it's not just a waste of space, right? And it's not just a potential environmental problem with it leaching out. It's also a waste of materials. I mean, this is all useful stuff that we just haven't learned how to recycle. And it's expensive stuff. So we can do better than that. I think we got to do better than that. So we do have some laws regulating hazardous waste. And these laws always have funny names, but you got to remember them. We have the RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. They make these crazy names for laws. Basically, what we're doing, it's a complicated act. We only ever have to remember a few key things. That tracks hazardous materials from cradle to grave. When we talk about products and materials and resources, we often use the term cradle to grave. I think you can guess what that means. That means from its very manufacture through transportation, use, and disposal. This law tracks all of that. And its goal is really just to minimize the creation of those substances. So things might get taxed or they might get regulated, but it starts with when they're created and sourced all the way to where they're disposed. The other law is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. CERCLA, if you can remember CERCLA. I can't ever remember CERCLA. Actually, after 20 years, I think I can. But you can also just remember it as the Superfund Act. That's easier to remember. So you might have heard of Superfund sites. Superfund sites are incredibly polluted areas, so polluted that local businesses, local areas couldn't possibly deal with it. Maybe it would cost billions of dollars to clean these sites up. Well, we don't have those billions of dollars. Where are we going to get that money? Who should have paid for these things? It should be whoever created them. Well, it's kind of late to charge them now. It might have been 50, 100 years. So the Superfund Act basically starts to tax just any polluting industry now, with the idea that we can start collecting money so we can start cleaning up these sites. So we're going to be taxing any company that has generates a lot of pollution, either chemical pollution or petroleum pollution. We're going to start taxing them now so that we can build up enough money to start cleaning up these sites that we should have never created in the first place. How many sites are there? Well, or what should we clean up first? I mean, we're only going to be able to clean a few of them to begin with. So we got to make some kind of priorities. And that was the second part of this legislation, was we're going to create a national priority list, an NPL. That's an important thing too, because we have to identify which sites there are. Okay, which sites are really nasty that we can't rely on local people to clean it up. This is going to be a federal program. And then which one is the worst? Let's clean that one first. So that's the national priorities list. So how many of these sites do you think there might be? I mean, they might cost $1 billion or $10 billion to clean up. Make a guess. How many sites? There's actually, I just looked this up, I change it every year, 1,344 of these Superfund cleanup sites. That's a lot. And I don't know when we're going to get a chance to clean up them all. It's a mess. Pay attention that most of them, or a lot of them anyway, are in New England. That's where a lot of manufacturing has happened traditionally. There's also quite a few over here in California as well. So I'm going to give you one example of one of these Superfund cleanup sites. And I don't know if you can see what that is. Hopefully you can see what that is. That is actually called Love Canal. Those are waste drums of hazardous material. It's a hazardous waste dump. I think it was called Love Canal probably before it was a hazardous waste dump. But a company owned this, a chemical manufacturing company owned this area, and they needed to get rid of their waste. That's their land. They put it in drums. They just threw it down on the ground. It's hard to imagine the little foresight that anyone had and the lack of environmental responsibility. I don't think it was out of malice. It was just that we just didn't know, and we just didn't think about it. You know, coming out of World War II, we thought we were the king of the world and we could do anything we want. And we could manipulate nature, and turns out that's not the case. So there was a school district who was looking for some cheap land, and they ended up buying this from this chemical manufacturer for $1. It's like they didn't need it anymore. They've already loaded up with all these chemicals, and the school board would love to have had it for cheap, so they sold it for $1. So that was the hazardous waste people didn't want it. School board didn't want it. It was a perfect solution. So what the school board did was they built homes. They built homes. They made a lot of money doing that. And they built schools. They developed that whole area. Well, I think you could probably, it sounds like a bad movie. You can probably guess what's going to happen. People started developing cancers, and other illnesses became apparent in the 70s. And what happened was these pools of water would just rise up. And this is at a school right here, this pool of water on the playground. And it would have these noxious chemicals in the water. It was seeping out because it was underneath the soil were these drums that were obviously leaking and corroding through and contaminating all of the water there. And so kids are playing in there. And so they evacuated the entire area in 1978. Everyone moved out. It was a big disaster. It was in the big news. And this is in the 70s. This is when the environmental movement was finally getting started. And they just closed the whole area out. And that was, what are you going to do? And again, it was going to be so costly to clean up this area. This was one of the instigators for creating the Superfund Act. So the federal Superfund legislation passed in 1980, and they cleaned up the whole spot. It only took them 14 years. They cleaned it off and removed it from the list. That was the first Superfund site, or one of the very first that they cleaned up. So the New York State Health Department commissioner said that that Love Canal will be remembered as a national symbol of failure to exercise a sense of concern for future generations. Nobody even thought twice about this stuff. Thankfully we do now. We've got a lot of laws. End of story? Unfortunately not. Recently, residents have been complaining, because they've cleaned up the area and they've since built homes again there. And now residents are, if you can see that, they're saying that the chemicals are continually make them sick. So this is an ongoing story. And the lesson really here is just don't create these chemicals in the first place, or when we do, we've got to dispose of them in a better way. So there's one more concept to talk about, and it's about hazardous waste, but it's not as an intense of hazardous waste. So these are called brownfields. And what a brownfield is, an abandoned area in a city generally, where you can't really build on it because people think it's contaminated. And it doesn't have to be real contamination. If people think it's contaminated, that's going to curb development. People aren't going to want to buy that. They're not going to take the risk. So that's a brownfield. A brownfield is usually an area in a town that is complicated to build on. Nobody wants to build on it because it might have had a gas station on it, or it might have had an old factory on it, and people just don't want to touch it. So this is a lot of potential actually for urban renewal, but it costs some money. It's really the responsibility of the state and local governments because they don't qualify to be on Superfund legislation. And there's a lot of them. I just looked this number up again, and it always is increasing. There's 450,000 brownfields in the United States, sites that are underdeveloped because of potential hazardous waste issues. That's 5 million acres of abandoned industrial property, often in cities. So those are brownfields. So there you go, and I will see you in class very soon.